So this is a copy of the sermon that will be preached at North Shields Evangelical Church on Sunday the 25th of February. It'd be really helpful if you could read Joshua chapters 23 and 24 before listening to this. There's a link below the video. Imagine a child runs up to their mother saying, "Mummy, Mummy, I just swallowed the head of my toothbrush." How would that mother react? How would the same mother respond if their child ran up to them and said, "Mummy, Mummy, I just swallowed my shoelaces"? You know, the first accident requires very little explanation. The child brushed their teeth, bit down hard on their toothbrush, and when they swallowed the water, the toothbrush head went down as well. The second accident, the swallowing of shoelaces, requires a lot of explanation. How on earth did shoelaces all the way down there get up to the mouth, all the way up here, and then into the mouth, and then down the throat? This kind of mistake requires a lot of explanation. The events that take place after these two chapters require a lot of explanation. The last two chapters of Joshua are full of warning after warning about the negative influence of the other nations, specifically the dangers of their idolatry. If Israel ignores these warnings, Joshua declares that these other nations will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs, and thorns in your eyes. Verse 13. But how does a thorn all the way down there get picked at, get looked at, picked up, and brought closer and closer and closer and closer to the eye, and then into the eye? Or more importantly, how did Israel get warned of the dangers of idolatry, being told to keep as far away from idolatry as possible? And yet within the first two chapters of Judges, we see them up close to idols, bowing down, embracing the very things that God has told them to avoid. Judges 2 verse 12. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. Now, before we look for the explanation of this, it's important we understand this was not an act of stupidity, but was an act of humanity. All humans are prone to going astray. We're just as at risk of making the same mistakes. But thankfully, we've the benefit of chapters 23 and 24, so that we might learn how not to make these mistakes. As it's written in the book of Corinthians, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. So what common temptations and mistakes do we see in these chapters? And how can we avoid them? Firstly, we need to look ahead. We all know the story of Titanic. If you've seen the 3-hour film, you'll probably remember the first hour of laughter, singing, dancing, and lavish meals. It started well, but if you've seen the film, you might remember that the chilling moment when the watchman shouts, "Iceberg, right ahead." But the fact is, the same team of watchmen had shouted, "Iceberg, a long, long, long way ahead." They'd shouted that only a few days earlier. It was just that this long-distant warning of danger was ignored. We see the same thing happening in the story of these Israelites. God warned them about the long-term dangers of these other nations, their negative influence and their idolatry. God had said that they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs, and thorns in your eyes. But when Israel picked up the thorny rose, they felt no immediate pain. And then when Israel began associating with the other nations, nobody got hurt to start with. They began the slippery slope described in verse 7. They associated with these other nations. So far, so good. They began invoking the names of their gods. They came to no harm. They increased their involvement, swearing by these gods, serving these gods, bowing down to these gods. Things were going okay. It was as if Israel was bringing that thorny rose closer and closer and closer to their eye. After all, it looked so pretty. But at times like this, it's worth remembering that 99% of passengers gave their starter 5 stars on their journey on the Titanic. Sadly, nobody was available to comment on the main course. It's worth remembering that the main course of sin is never as tasty as the starter. Pride and a bit of self-congratulation, they feel great at first, until you trip over your own shoelaces. Lies get you out of a bad situation quickly, but they gradually erode your character, and they can't protect you long term. Entertaining certain thoughts can be pleasurable. Bitter thoughts, lustful thoughts, thoughts in which you fantasize about a better life. But as soon as these thoughts escalate, they'll cause you a lot of misery. There are hundreds of other examples that we could use to make the same point. Long term, all sin brings misery and does damage, regardless of its first appearance. That's why God warned Israel to look ahead, to see the dangers, and keep as far away from the thorns of idolatry as possible, rather than bringing the thorn to their eye for a closer look. We need to look ahead, and God looks for action. God didn't just warn Israel about the dangers of temptation. He taught them the importance of repentance. In chapter 24, verse 21, we read, "But the people said to Joshua, 'No, we will serve the Lord.'" Joshua continues, "Now then," said Joshua, "throw away the foreign gods that are among you, and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel." And the people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord our God and obey him." The people told Joshua they would serve the Lord. Joshua calls them to put their words into actions. Throw away the foreign gods that are among you. The people responded with yet more words. And the people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord our God and obey him." This was like an alcoholic saying, "This is my last pint," as they crack open a 6-pack. This is like somebody announcing the start of their diet as they walk into Cadbury's World. It's like a shopaholic declaring never again as they log on to browse the Boxing Day sales. No amount of words are a substitute for action. Talking about obedience is not the same as obedience itself. Joshua had called Israel to throw away the idols that are among you. The people said, "We will obey." Yet the 6-pack of idols was still in their cupboards at home. It's pretty simple maths to work out where this lack of action would lead. In a battle of something versus nothing, what wins? If you have something that is a temptation to you and you do nothing about it, what happens? If some thought keeps popping into your head and you do nothing to challenge it, what happens? If there is some sin you are prone to and you take no responsibility for it, what happens? When God identifies some area of your life that needs to change, let us all remember, no amount of words is a substitute for action. We need to look ahead. God is looking for action in our lives, and we need to look left and right. So far we've looked at the dangers of sin and the importance of obedience. And if you know something of what the Bible says, you'll know that it also talks about the forgiveness of sins. It talks about how we're not saved by our obedience, by what we do, but by Jesus' obedience, by what he has done. We are saved and made right with God. This is good news, as Joshua clearly states in verse 19. You are not able to serve the Lord. By halfway into this week, all of us will be in need of God's great mercy. Our obedience to what we hear today will never ever be perfect. But this doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about the dangers of sin and the value of obedience. Not talking about these things would be like only looking left when you cross the road. Good news! The left side of the road is all clear. Bang! Bad news. You didn't look in the other direction. Notice how Joshua calls us to look left and right in verse 15. Verse 15 of chapter 23. Just as all the good things the Lord your God has promised you have come to you, so he will bring on you all the evil things he has threatened. Look left. God had blessed Israel. God had fulfilled his promises to them as a nation, despite their fluctuating obedience in the past. Look right. There would be a cost to their disobedience. There would be consequences if they disobeyed. Yes, there are plenty of times in the Bible where God speaks of a way back for sinners. Wonderfully, God's mercy and forgiveness and grace are always available. But let me ask you this. Point in the direction that you'd head in to get to the next town. Technically speaking, you can get to the town both ways. If your next town is that way, you can walk that way and get there in 5 minutes. But technically speaking, you could go that way as well. The world is round, and so if you kept walking that way all the way round the world for a few years, you'd end up in that town eventually. But there would be consequences to doing so, and there's a high chance that you'd get lost. In much the same way, many people who have gone astray from God, who have headed in that wrong direction, have found their way back to God. They've discovered God's wonderful mercy towards those who go astray. But let's not forget that there has probably been a cost to them going astray. And some who go astray from God get lost and never return. They give up their faith entirely. So as well as looking left at the mercy of God towards the disobedient, let's also look right at the costs of disobedience as well. And fourthly and finally, let us look to the law and to the Lord. I don't know if any of you love signing legal contracts. It's hardly the most enjoyable thing to do. To look after page of endless legal terminology. To file through multiple pages of terms and conditions, points, subpoints and additional points. Only to sign the contract and then discover in the small print that signing in blue ink will result in an additional fee of £1,000. Signing legal contracts is not enjoyable, and yet many describe signing a legal contract as the happiest day of their life. The signing of the legal contract called marriage occurs in a special place, where the groom admires his bride as she walks down the aisle. He gazes into her eyes whilst the marriage vows are read, and he signs "I do" with a smile on his face. This was the type of legal contract or covenant that Joshua was calling the people of Israel to sign. This contract signing, this covenant, took place in a special place. In verse 1 it says, Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. Now Shechem was the first place where Abraham set foot in the promised land. He built an altar there and looked forward to all the good that God would do for him. Shechem was also the place where Jacob returned to after leaving the promised land for a time. There Jacob built an altar and looked back on all the good that God had done for him. God had Israel sign the legal contract at Shechem because he wanted them to also look back and look forward. He wanted them to look back at all the good that God had done for them in the past. And he wanted them to look forward to all the good God promised he would do in the future. I don't know if you noticed, but 18 times in chapter 24, the word I appears. God says, I took your father Abraham, I gave him Isaac, I gave Jacob, I sent Moses and Aaron to rescue from the Egyptians. I afflicted the Egyptians, I brought you out. I brought you to the land of the Amorites, I gave them into your hands. I would not listen to the Balaam who wanted to curse you, I delivered you out of his hand. I gave you a land, etc., etc. God says to Israel, look at all the good that I have done for you. In his opening sentence to Israel, God uses the word will 3 times. The Lord your God himself will push them out for your sake. He will drive them out before you, and you will take possession of the land, as the Lord your God has promised you. God says to Israel, look at all the good I will do for you in the future. You know, just as a vicar asks the groom to listen to the law and look the bride in the eyes, so too God asks his people to listen to the law and look him in the eyes. When we look at God's goodness, the great things he has done in the past, the great things he promises to do in the future, when we look at God's goodness, saying I do becomes so much easier. I do say no to temptation because I appreciate my relationship with God and I don't want to harm it. I do forsake all others because there is no better other that I could have. I do say yes to obedience because I trust God has my best interests at heart. Don't just listen to the law, the words in the Bible that call us to live a certain way. Don't just listen to the law, look the Lord in the eyes. Remember who he is and all that he has done. And yet, the sad fact is, Israel did not. And so we have to ask, why? Chapter 23 verse 1 drops a hint. After a long time had passed, and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua by then a very old man. It's rare that you can tell a person that they are old twice and not end up with a black eye. And yet these chapters mention Joshua's age and impending death repeatedly. The reason for this is hinted at the end of Joshua and again at the beginning of Judges. The end of Joshua we read that Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua. Judges opens with these words in chapter 2. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua. These chapters seem to imply that Israel's connection to the Lord was limited to Joshua. They served the Lord when Joshua was over them. When Joshua went, their connection with the Lord went as well. It's like a person's connection with the Lord being limited to a particular church, or being connected to nostalgia or traditions. When the church changes, or its traditions end, or when the church closes, their connection with God ends. It's like a person's connection with the Lord being dependent on good times. Their faith collapses when life does not go the way they want. It's like a person's faith being second-hand. They have a faith through others who do know the Lord. They piggyback on the faith of others, perhaps a leader or other Christians that they hang around with. And yet they don't have a personal faith, And what faith they have collapses when they're not around these other Christians, or when these other Christians let them down. Like with Israel and Joshua, when your connection with God comes through someone or something else, as soon as you take that other thing away, that connection to the Lord is cut. But thanks be to God, he has given us another Joshua. Jesus, whose Hebrew name was Joshua. Jesus can help us not just know of the Lord, but help us know the Lord for ourselves. And Jesus, he died and rose and lives today. He is always available to call on for help. Jesus can lift us up and get us back on track when we go astray. But Jesus is the place to start to begin a living relationship with the Lord. And Jesus is the place to go back to again and again during our times of need. If you don't know the Lord yet, why not read the book of John in the Bible? Get to know this Jesus who the Bible is repeatedly pointing us to. And if you're struggling in any way, in any aspect of your faith, you might be sick of hearing it, but go back to Jesus again and again. In Jesus we find all that we need to keep going in the Christian life. I'll end with the book of Hebrews, the chapter 4, verse 14. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are. Yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need.